The Prime Minister will today confirm an earlier timetable for the withdrawal of Australian troops from Afghanistan. It comes ahead of a major NATO summit on this issue in Chicago next month, and it will see the majority of Australian troops withdrawn from Afghanistan by the time of the next federal election due late next year. Joining me on the program this morning to discuss this and the other issues of the day, the Deputy Opposition Leader in the Senate and Shadow Attorney General, Senator George Brandis. Senator Brandis, obviously I want to ask you about the proceedings starting in the High Court today when it comes to the tobacco industry's challenge to the government's plain packaging laws. We'll get to that in a moment. First of all, the Coalition's view on this news that the Prime Minister is going to announce an earlier timetable for the withdrawal of Australian troops.
Well, Kieran, this is obviously a very important development. We'll wait until we hear what the Prime Minister has to say later in the morning, and in particular, we'll listen with great care to the reasons she gives for this anticipated early withdrawal. But let me just make this point. I hope that any decision the Australian government makes in relation to the deployment of our troops in Afghanistan is a decision made on the advice of the military commanders in the field and on the basis of battleground considerations in Afghanistan, not a decision made domestically to serve a domestic political agenda. Now, I don't want to prejudge it. I think it's fair to wait and hear what the Prime Minister has to say, but now we've been told for many years now that 2014 was the assessed earliest date for withdrawal, and that was on the basis of military advice. If there has been a change to the military advice, we'd be interested to hear the detail of it.
That domestic political agenda you're referring to is obviously the fact that the troops will now, in bulk, be home before the next election.
Well, it would be a shameful thing if, after nearly 12 years of deployment in Afghanistan and the loss of more than 30 Australian lives, this mission were foreshortened for reasons of domestic political convenience for the Labor Party rather than on the basis of the advice of the military commanders in the field. Now, having said that, we'll listen to see what the Prime Minister has to say and address the situation again, no doubt, later in the day.
If we're talking about domestic political agendas, though, isn't it the reality that the thing that's driving this is the US timetable, the US presidential election in November, and really what we do is fit in with what the overarching major ally within the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan is doing. That is the United States.
Well, obviously there is a functional and important link between the Australian deployment and the much greater American deployment. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, Kieran. Let's just wait and see what the Prime Minister has to say a little later in the day.
OK, let's move to the High Court challenge today, and the major tobacco companies are going to challenge the government's plain packaging laws. Can I just clarify for our viewers what the opposition's stance is when it comes to these laws?
Well, we supported the laws. We supported the introduction of plain packaging. In fact, it was during the Howard government, when Mr Abbott was the Health Minister, that the most recent development in relation to the presentation of tobacco products, that is the vivid health warnings on tobacco packets, were introduced, and we've made it clear that we support taking the matter one step further, that is to have mandatory plain packaging. But that having been said, the tobacco companies are perfectly entitled to assert their intellectual property rights in the High Court. They're not doing the wrong thing by defending what they say are their intellectual property rights, and we will, of course, as the government should, abide the decision of the High Court.
And what's your sense as a barrister? What do you think that the outcome will be? Will the public health benefits outweigh the company's copyright ownership and the brand ownership?
Well, let me say two things about that. First of all, I haven't read the written briefs of argument that have been filed in the High Court. I've had a relatively brief discussion with Mr Alan Myers, who is representing one of the principal claimants in the High Court, so I have a general understanding of the argument that will be being run on behalf of the tobacco companies. But it's not really a question of weighing up at least from the Court's point of view, it shouldn't be a question of weighing up the rights of the tobacco companies versus the public health interest involved. That's a political consideration. What the High Court, of course, will be addressing is the more specific legal issues, and in particular the issue about whether this constitutes an acquisition of property without compensation under the Constitution.
This would be one of the rare cases, though, where the coalition hopes the government wins this legal case, Senator Brandis?
Well, as I said before, Kieran, we support the government's position. It takes further a series of policies that we ourselves introduced some years ago. Every citizen, including every corporate citizen, has a right to assert their rights, including their property rights, before the High Court, and we'll await the decision of the court.
OK, and on a couple of other issues, Senator Brandis, today's news poll shows a collapse in support for the Prime Minister when it comes to the trustworthy rating, but the fact is Tony Abbott still remains unpopular when compared to Julia Gillard and this government. That has got to be a lingering concern for the coalition and your strategists, that even with such an unpopular Prime Minister and government, that your own leader remains on the nose in large parts of the electorate.
Well, I don't know that that's what the poll reveals, Kieran. The preferred Prime Minister rating, as I recall, it has Mr Abbott slightly ahead in the latest news poll. But, I think what this poll does is tell a story, and that is that there has been a complete collapse of public respect for this government. And going back all the way to a year or so ago, when Julia Gillard announced that the government, having been elected on a promise not to introduce a carbon tax, was going to double-cross the electorate and introduce a carbon tax. And if you look at the lines in those polls, you saw about a year ago a very sharp decline in the government's support and in public respect for Julia Gillard. They've moved around up and down a little bit, because these polls always do move around a little bit, but by and large the government has not recovered from that position. And as a Queenslander, Kieran, I can't help but draw the comparison with the government of Anna Bligh, which within weeks of having been re-elected at the 2009 state election, broke one of the basic promises on which it was re-elected about not abolishing the petrol subsidy, and proceeded to privatise the state's assets, having said nothing about that in the election campaign. And the electorate remembered that. It remembered it for the entire term of the government, and 3 years later that government got what was coming to it.
Well, this new Queensland government hasn't got off to the best start. What about this news? I'm not sure all of our viewers would have caught up with it, but the Queensland Police Minister, about a fortnight after being sworn in, has resigned. He was apparently... the police have alleged that he was driving a car while his licence was suspended. He handed in his resignation. Campbell Newman's accepted it. Not a good start.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, this is a mishap for Mr Gibson. As I understand it,
if a minister steps down within a fortnight, that's obviously not a good start, is it?
Well, let me answer your question. As I understand it, Mr Gibson overlooked paying a traffic fine, and his licence was automatically suspended after the expiry of the period by which the fine was to have been paid. And as I understand it, he was unaware of that fact. When it came to his notice yesterday, he offered his resignation. Now, it is a mishap. I feel very sorry for Mr Gibson. I think when it comes to traffic offences, he who has no sin should cast the first stone. But what it tells you, I think, about the government of Campbell Newman is that it is going to be absolutely punctilious when it comes to ministerial standards. And I can't help but draw the comparison between Mr Gibson, who has fallen on his sword and offered his ministerial office because of essentially an oversight in relation to a traffic fine, and the case of Mr Craig Thompson, who is the subject of 2 major police investigations in 2 states over alleged fraudulent conduct involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Julia Gillard can't see that he's done anything wrong. So, I think this is a tale of 2 cities, Brisbane and Canberra, or perhaps a tale of 2 governments.
But one person's admitted it, the other hasn't.
Well, Mr Craig Thomson hasn't even given the statement to the House of Representatives that the House of Representatives standing orders specifically provide for in cases like this, where there are serious allegations which a Member of Parliament disputes. He's able to make a personal explanation, and it speaks volumes about Mr Thomson that he hasn't taken the opportunity to do so.
Well, we've covered quite a few areas this morning. I appreciate your time, Senator Brandis. Thanks for that.
Pleasure, Kieran.